Hey everyone, I'm Ian McCarthy of Lifting for Life and No Bullshit Bodybuilding, and I'm really excited to be here today with Mike Israetel, Dr. Mike Israetel. I know, we really need to note that bit, the meme of, if you have a PhD, everyone needs to know. And as I was telling Mike off camera before we started, my preference really as a consumer is to forego long introductions because typically folks know who the guest is and they just want to get to it. But Mike, if you just want to take 12 seconds to introduce yourself to the three people who perhaps don't know who you are.
Thanks for having me on.
For sure. Thanks for being
Dr.
here.
Mike Israetel, awesome. Dr. Mike Israetel, PhD in sport physiology from East Tennessee State University. I've got other degrees as well. I'm a professor of sports science at Temple in Philadelphia. I am a shitty competitive bodybuilder and a decent competitive grappler in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I write things. I've written a bunch of books and stuff like that. And I like to think about getting jacked, getting lean, getting strong, and not having any friends, which I don't in real life. So I cry a lot. That's my number one hobby.
Perfect. So you sound really fulfilled.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So I invited you on to discuss training volume because this is an ongoing discussion on social media. And in particular, what you've become known for over the past year is this concept of maximum recoverable volume. So again, for the few people who are perhaps unfamiliar with that, could you just speak to what that is and then give your thesis, and then we can really dig into it?
Sure. Yeah, the idea of MRV actually was something I developed in sort of some good discussions with my colleagues as well when we were strength and conditioning coaches and sports scientists who advised coaches in sport teams with the design of their annual plans and their total workloads per unit session, per unit week, per unit month. And we were trying to always get this concept across because we were the sports scientists required to get these kinds of concepts across so that training can be intelligent. And we never had a term for what we were saying. What we were saying is, look, you can do only so much, and that so much is about how much you can recover from. If you do much less than that, which is almost never a problem in athletics, because everyone has that hard-nosed attitude of do more, then you won't get as good as you could be. So we have to cut coaches some slack that there's this idea that they think training more is better. There is some truth to that. And then above that, well, if you can't recover anymore, it's pointless to keep training. You only get worse and worse and worse by definition. So there is such a thing as too much. And originally, the entire concept was centered around conveying that too much, because very many people weren't going to debate you on that, the too little is a problem. Right. Because indeed, when athletics we were working, too little is not really a problem. Everyone has the idea of do more. So ironically, now I'm kind of known for being this guy who's advocating way too much training. The original development of the concept was to kind of bring that training volume into perspective and say, look, you can't just keep doing more and more and more. You can only do up to as much as you can recover. And I think that extension to bodybuilding, powerlifting, et cetera, is a very simple extension. It's just another subcategory of sport. The MRV concept, we can get much more technical, which I'm sure we will, delineating MRV and MAV, for example, maximum adaptive volume. But the very basic how to define MRV in very basic terms is there is such a thing as way too little training. You could be doing more and get better. And there is such a thing as way too much training. So you have to try to find how much training is in that kind of general Goldilocks zone of just enough training to get you your best results, but so that you can still recover.
Excellent. Thank you. And in watching a presentation that you gave last year where you officially presented this concept to the scientific community, what struck me is almost everything you said I agreed with, and it struck me as very intuitive. But on a rational level, I kept having the thought of, and you did address this at the end of the discussion, is intuition really good enough here? The intuition that if you do more up to the point at which you can't do more and continue recovering, you will benefit from that. That strikes me as an assumption, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But my thought was, there is, by definition, a difference between the most you can recover from and the most that you can actually benefit or adapt from. Now, the question is, is there a discrepancy in practice? And if so, what is it? So why was the thought? So I get from an athletic perspective, you have coaches and athletes in particular who are thinking, do more, and they're not recovering and they would benefit from doing less. But why not emphasize, and maybe this is something that you've actually kind of changed your view on in the intervening period, given all the discussion that it's caused, but why not emphasize more adaptive volume? I really like the term effective volume, meaning, it's pretty intuitive, but volume that actually causes an effect? Because I do sense that there's a point at which you can probably do more, but it's just junk volume.
Why did I emphasize recovery first? Because the claim that there is a maximum effective volume or a maximum adaptive volume by itself, to me originally, had nothing behind it as far as logic was concerned that could be very convincing to coaches. You could say it's now just another claim by another sports scientist who says, you're doing too much. More than this won't make the athletes better. And they'll say, okay, but I think it will. And you say, well, I think it won't because here's the data. And I don't read data. There's no logical reason why your number of 15 total minutes of playing soccer today versus my, it's just like a gunshot claim. Put much logic behind it to start to try to explain it. But if you can say, look, here's the deal. If you can't recover anymore, you're for sure not going to be able to get better. And then you can stare coaches in the face and say, look, if you're not recovering, what the hell's the point of coming in? Because recovery means return to baseline performance. If you're not recovering, you're getting worse and worse and worse by definition over the days, weeks, months, whatever. And then they go, fuck. Okay, fine. There is such a thing as training too much. Now, that recovery, of course, doesn't take into effect that adaptation itself is a sort of a resource expensive process, or at least somewhat costly. And that in order to get your best possible results, you have to do so much work only up to your maximum adaptive volume, because the difference between maximum adaptive volume and maximum recoverable volume is going to be how much energy it actually takes to undergo recovery processes, right? So, energy it takes to undergo adaptive processes. Because if you say, I'm going to train all the way at my MRV, you will recover, but you will have no energy for anything else, including adaptation, for sure. So you'll just return to baseline, return to baseline, return to baseline. In many sports that we address, the adaptations made are very, very, very non-energy dependent. They're neural and technical adaptations. For example, how much better you get at soccer at the actual movements of soccer. How many calories does it require to rewire neurons to make you better at soccer? I mean, fucking negligible. So the MAV and MRV are really close together. In a sport with a lot of homeostatic disruption, bodybuilding, for example, I mean, you're literally degrading physical tissues, and the construction of actual grand scale material has to be undergone, and that's a lot of homeostatic disruption. That's going to cost you more calories. It's going to cost you more resources. So the MAV and MRV are probably more different in those. You can continue to be the same in bodybuilding, training quite a lot, but to get better, you have to reduce your training quite a bit. Am I willing to put set numbers on that? Yeah, I can give you a shotgun blast estimate. I think 3 to 5 sets per week per body part. That's probably the difference between MRV and MAV. I don't think it's something like 10 sets. I don't think that for someone who can recover from 20 sets a week of squats, that 10 sets is the most to make them grow. I think that's nonsense. There's no physiological rationale that adaptation actually costs that much physical resource. And we look at I'm sure you've looked into literature somewhat, the actual gram of nutrient built per any training week, gram of muscle built is like some really fucking depressing number, no matter how much the cell tech ads tell you. And the amount of energy, if we take in all the possible processes to actually construct that muscle, et cetera, recover you fully, it's not that much. I mean, it's something for sure. But I think the MRV and MAV are close enough together to where you tell people, look, MRV, this is your top end estimate. And the reason that we talk about MRV, the reason I started talking about it is because it was easy to communicate to coaches. Right under it, you can immediately intuit MAV, and it's a much better concept. That's really what we're looking for. But another good reason to look to MRV is the concept of overreaching and the concept of overload. Then in a logically designed program, every now and again, you do have to push to and possibly above your MRV. Insofar as hypertrophy is largely volume-based at a minimum intensity, right? You get bigger by doing lots of volume and by doing more volume at heavy weights than you're used to doing, right? If you used to squat 500 pounds and now you squat 600, but the way you got to 600 was largely neural adaptations and doing relatively low volume training, there's not really a guarantee that your muscles are going to get bigger. But if you used to be able to do 405 on the squat and you could do it now for 6 sets of 10 on the squat, there's no way around that other than getting bigger. There are no other adaptations. The only adaptation you have to, high reps is really just generating more muscle size. The nervous system can only crank out so much help for you there. So we know that you have to challenge that physiology on occasion, but you can't do it all the time. So the MRV, from a mesocycle perspective, is your goal. You're going to start lower than your MRV, probably somewhere like your minimum effective dose. You're going to apply the overload principle, jumping up and up and up every week or so in how much volume you're doing and probably intensity, but that's another discussion. So you're going to go up and up and up in volume. Somewhere in there, you're going to pass your maximum adaptive volume. But because, and I'm going to be really clear about this, and you get to your MRV and you deload. I want to be clear that the MAV is not a goal, because having that as a goal violates the overload principle. The overload principle states that you have to make training successively more difficult. So if you just try to hit your MAV every single time, you're violating overload because your training is the same every single time. For example, if let's say 16 sets per week is around your MAV, then if you try week 1, 16 sets, week 2, 16 sets, week 3, 16 sets, where's the overload? It's the same number of sets every single time. Yeah, you can increase the weight on the bar, and that ups volume just a little bit, but probably not sufficiently to really present that volume-based overload, which we know is probably critical for hypertrophy. So because of the overload idea, the concept of minimum effective dose is very important to know. The concept of maximum recoverable volume is very important to know. It's important to know those both for which ones apply to you. Let's say 10 on the minimum effective dose and 20 on maximum recoverable volume, just as examples. Somewhere in the middle is going to be your maximum adaptive volume, but it's by definition a value you can't shoot for. Because as soon as you start shooting for it, the second workout after, but you're still shooting for that one, you're no longer providing overloads. You have to move along that continuum, deload and repeat. I think that's just part of the fundamental structure of training.
Awesome. So this has brought up a number of different points, and the one I want to address now, it's a bit of an aside really from MRV, but speaking to overload and wanting to actually exceed maximum adaptive volume, are you really doing that, or is it just increasing? So
Others? Go ahead.
In other words, yes, you might be doing more than what your original adaptive volume is, but because you're adapting, that's increasing.
Yeah, I think you're asking a question that is predictably arise to someone of your intellectual depth. I think that the reality is that largely, now I usually don't say this because it confuses the fuck out of people.
Right.
So enjoy understanding it and then confusing the fuck out of hopefully few of your listeners, but someone's going to take the shit way out of context. So fuck you, you're welcome. I'm going to take shit for this in advance. Your MAV starts out close to your minimum effective dose at the beginning of a mesocycle, because hypothetically you're not used to that particular arrangement of exercises or new exercises or new rep ranges, etc. The amount of work you have to do to adapt maximally to relatively new movements and rep ranges is actually on the low side. So your MAV starts at close to your minimum effective dose, but as soon as you hit that first workout, your maximum adaptive volume is actually now higher, right? Because you have to do more by the overload principle, and you're now more used to stuff. So your MAV actually is a floating number that goes from about your minimum effective dose and over the weeks rises up to where your maximum adaptive volume is now really close to your maximum recoverable volume. Mm-hmm. So the two end up meeting at the top, but then your fatigue is so high it's unsustainable to continue to do that. Here's another really interesting irony, a little bit of an aside even from this point. People ask, why can't pro bodybuilders just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger? Because after you've taken all the drugs in the world and you've perfected every single part of your recovery, and you're 45 years old, your hypothetical MAV may actually be above your MRV. So the question to how do you grow then? The answer is you don't fucking grow. Period. You just don't.
Right.
So your MAV, to answer your direct question, is a floating value that actually does change week to week to week. So the best way to make sure we're hitting that is to intelligently rotate our exercises, use good variation, and start close to our minimum effective dose and work our way up to our maximum recoverable volume, deload, bring fatigue down, possibly change exercises and rep scheme, possibly not, depending on our goal and a variety of factors, and continue on. What I don't like to see, and one of the reasons I'm a big advocate of this approach, is kind of a very stale sort of training, like 3x5. Like, what are you doing this week? 3x5. What do you do next week? 3x5. What are you doing 4 months from now? 3x5. Like, fuck. Like, you're shitting away variation. You're shitting away a good part of overload because you can't really expect that to be continuously challenging to the physiology.
Mm-hmm. So, given you've acknowledged maximum adaptive volume is going to change over time, up, but it can also go down. How would going above that ever not be superfluous? Because by definition, well, not by definition, but in fact, it would exceed that which you would benefit from.
Mm-hmm. Going above that has been shown to be effective in only the very short term in a process called functional overreaching.
Mhm.
So we used to think before functional overreaching was understood that you just stay within your recovery capabilities all the time. And what people tend to notice first in sport practice and then later in the formal literature was that if you take a person's total volume or intensity that they're used to doing, you multiply it by 2, which is completely insane, or 1.5, and you do that for 4 or 5 weeks, you get formal overtraining syndrome, and they just go to hell, and they may never recover, or they may recover months later. It sucks. If you do that for 1 or 2 weeks, they get a little bit worse during that time, but then they go through a really massive kind of big delayed version of supercompensation, and they get bigger and stronger and faster than you would even expect them to if you were just hitting under their MRV. So functional overreaching is the special state in which it makes sense only on very small occasions, only when you've used every other trick in the book. That is, you can't really go up anymore because you're already past your MAV. You can stay up above your maximum adaptive volume just for a microcycle or so. That's right at or above your MRV in that case. And then as you deload, you get those big functional overreaching patterns. I would not be, to me, the idea never made much sense to begin with, but the evidence for it is quite clear. The evidence and practices for it is quite clear. So functional overreaching works. As long as you take that deload right after.
Right.
If you just return to normal training, Jesus, you might never recover, and then it was just a waste of your time and possibly worse. So that's the rationale for going above your maximum adaptive volume, because in the grand scheme, you're not above your maximum adaptive volume. Because if you take a 2-week view, right, have this huge volume on week 1, but week 2 is the deload, right? So your overall volume is actually just fine because the deload's really, really easy. But so it's kind of like saying, it's the difference between being full all day by eating a shitload of really huge meals, and that's how you gain weight, versus not being very full in the morning and being really full at night. And on average, you're actually eucaloric and you don't gain any weight. Because how come you're not gaining any weight if you're full? Well, I'm not full all the time, right? So that functional overreaching totally works if you hit for 1 or 2 microcycles, but after that, you've got to bring it down. And if you don't, the entire process doesn't work.
Now, I could definitely see that being more effective, and I'm coming at this from the perspective of hypertrophy, by the way, because this is just my my personal interest. I've never been good at strength training; it's never really been fulfilling for me. So hypertrophy is the thing, and I could definitely see this being more effective given a particular shorter-term time frame, like maximizing muscle growth in, let's say, 12 weeks, but over the long term, are you convinced that this will yield more hypertrophy than someone who largely auto-regulates their training? And the result of that would be that it would be more consistent. So when the person who overreaches and then deloads is deloading and then building back up, and through this period, this isn't really their overload period, like they're probably not actually accumulating new tissue. Maybe the person who's auto-regulating is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially for more advanced athletes, I think it's pretty good guess that they require really super physiological stimuli to continue to progress. That good old quality, regular, under your MRV training might just not cut it much for them anymore. That for people in the beginner and intermediate stages, good old-fashioned training with not a whole lot of tricks like overreaching is very, very good. For especially more advanced athletes, you have to do stuff that is, in the very short term, unsustainable because the physiology becomes very resistant to progression. That's fact number 1 about more advanced people. Fact number 2 is that when they go through relatively low training periods, they hold on to muscle tissue and much better than beginners. You deload beginners too often, they just lose a shitload of muscle during deloads. They lose muscle during detraining phases. But it's been shown that more advanced athletes hold the tissue better. So for them, you take a more pulsatile approach. Really blast, really relax. Really blast, really relax, as opposed to for beginners and intermediates where you can do slower waves. I think auto-regulation applies across the board to everyone. So, during that 5-week accumulation phase, how fast you accumulate has to be done in an auto manner. You can't just say, okay, this week 15 sets, next week 18 sets. It turned out 18 sets was too much for you. Do you just go to straight to 20 sets the next week? Well, no, that's nonsense. You might repeat 18 again, or you might go down to 16 because too much. So auto-regulation is great, but I think auto-regulation, at another point, doesn't last enough time for fatigue management perspective. So that deload isn't just good because you overreached beforehand. Periodic deloading is good to attend to some factors that don't recover on the same basis that your perception allows. For example, damage to microstructures, including muscle and more worrisome damage to tendons, occurs throughout a heavy loading mesocycle. You will absolutely tear parts of your tendon apart. If you take several days of lighter training, as most autoregulation schemes would have you do, once you feel beat up, your nervous system can recover quite well, your muscular system can recover quite well, your psychology can recover really well, you're going to feel A-okay, and you're going to start blasting it again, just like you always did. Mm-hmm. The problem is you never quite feel your tendons fraying, literally because they are not innervated to nearly the extent they would be for you to feel that sort of thing. And there's tons of reports of people feeling great, boom, quad flies off the bone. Okay, has had no idea that was going to happen. Why? I think one way to get there is an abuse of autoregulation. Autoregulation is a great tool, but every now and again you have to have programmed, especially active rests, 2 to 3 week phases of lighter, easier training, but I think deloads are important as well. I don't think you should always deload when you have to, but every now and again, every at least 2 to 3 months, you should take a week of easy training just to make sure that all those structures you can't feel also drop their specific levels of fatigue. Because autoregulation is predicated usually on performance. If you can regain your earlier performance, you are recovered, right? So if you have a bunch of RPE 10 lifts by accident, you're like, okay, I'm fucked up. Go back down weights and sets and reps to make sure that your RPE starts to become normal again. You feel good, you can perform, great. But it still doesn't say much about the microstructural damage of things you can't feel. You have to attend to them every now and again, because in autoregulated, just pure autoregulation, you may go months, you may go years without ever taking any dedicated time to really let those structures recover. And the problem is you have no idea if they're recovered or not. You will get yourself into trouble again.
Mm-hmm. How much do you think you can tighten up this time frame? In that, interestingly, I find that a lot of what you say about this I agree with, but I'll even apply it on a weekly basis. In other words, there will be days that are explicitly designed to be days where, and again, this is even in the case of hypertrophy-specific training, where the goal is increasing external load very clearly from week to week, etc. And then those will be, and it depends on the circumstance, but those might be followed by days that are very much lighter, training muscles at short muscle lengths, like generating minimal muscle damage, really easy to recover from, trying to get a pump, good contraction, etc. And so I wonder if you can get a lot of the same benefits, but by condensing, instead of taking a time frame where you have weeks of training significantly below your maximum recoverable volume, and then it increases and increases, and combine that shorter term, and then certainly taking autoregulation into account, could that have similar or equivalent benefit?
Absolutely. I actually think both approaches need to be used. So your mic cycle should have quite a bit of versatility in it. So for example, let's pick a muscle group like your lats. You can have, and let's just keep it simple. Not that I'm advocating training muscles twice a week. You could train 2, 3, 4 times. You have really big lat day, and then easier lat day, perhaps different angle, different focus, more bicep, more delt work, or something like that. So this lat day right here is actually quite close to your lat MRV if you were to do 2 of these days in a row. Just it by itself is a big-ass workout. But you have this little workout afterward. Next week, you do this. Next week, you do that. Next week, you do that. Make sense? So I think that intra-microcycle pulsatility is absolutely a great thing. I think it doesn't quite cancel out the need for a longer-term elevation of structure, but I think it certainly adds to it and allows you to get more bang for your buck versus just doing everything the same every week and every day, starting out super-duper slow and then really inching away. I think you could do a lot of variation within it, but I think on average those still need to increase. And about every 4 to 8 weeks, people are going to get a longer period of fatigue reduction. Whether that comes through autoregulation when they feel it or a planned deload, I think it should come from both. Kind of like a deload 6 to 8 weeks away. If you still feel good at 6, keep cranking. If you already beat up at 6, deload. But after 8 weeks, you just make a cutoff and say, okay, I need to take this deload just for purposes of knowing that I've fixed all the damage. And then next time, if I still didn't feel beat up, I know that I'm actually underestimating my MRV. I can start doing more every microcycle from now.
Absolutely. What do you think of not instituting deloads, but simply instituting new programs as the means of addressing this. And I ask really from, like, just speaking for myself, in that psychologically, deloads don't do it for me. Like, you know, for one thing, I want to be in the gym all the time, so just taking a lot of time off doesn't make sense. And I find deloads very unfulfilling. So what I've done is, when I get to the point where, I mean, in some cases, I'll get to the point where I just, like, really cannot sustain what I'm doing. In other words, I'm not recovering. But as I've trained more, I've tried to respond before I get to that point. I will significantly alter my program. So at the very least, exercise selection, but might even shift to a different split, etc. So at no point do I have, this is a deload. But again, because of the variation in exercise selection, and because naturally if I'm unused to those movements, loads are going to be lighter, etc., I find that I get the same benefits, and I'm able to sustain that over time. So at least in the case of hypertrophy training, do you think that would be, again, do you think that would be, you know, comparably effective?
It would be somewhat effective, and I think for a time it would work. I think that varying exercises every mesocycle is a very good fatigue management strategy. And I think it replaces the deload, but I think it certainly allows you to go for longer mesocycles of loading before you alter. So, for example, here's what I mean. If you're going to do high bar squats for 6 months straight and have the identical workout more or less for 6 months straight, you're going to have to deload every now and again, because the specific fatigue on those particular structures is just going to get outlandish. So you might have to deload 3 times during that period. If you alter your exercises once every 2 months or so during that period, or 3 months, you might have half as many deloads that you have to do, because the variation itself alters the stimulus and doesn't hit the same fibers anymore, et cetera. So absolutely, that variation definitely helps. Where I would caution is the overuse of variation as a proxy for poor fatigue management in volume load. For example, a lot of higher level bodybuilders, a lot of bodybuilders in general, seem to have a different workout every single day. Every single time they train back, it's different movements, and they go by feel. Well, that feels actually okay from a fatigue management perspective, because if you bent rows feel fucked up, you know you went too far, and you're going to do more pull downs a day or something. What ends up happening is their variation is so high, violating the principle of direct adaptation. It seems that muscles grow best when there's repeated exposures to the same stimulus, not altered every single time. Now, you will still grow muscle like that. These guys are huge, the biggest people in the world. You have to make sure that when you use variation as a form of fatigue management, you got to knock it out for a while at least. I say a whole mesocycle, 3, 4, maybe even 6 elevations of volume load with the same movements, really focusing on the same movements and making sure to get the most out of them, then switching. What I do is I deload, then switch. If I didn't deload and I switch, I'd have to start with much lower volumes even after switching. So then the first workout is, yeah, okay, you switch to a new thing, but you're kind of just should have just deloaded anyway. I think so the switching is absolutely a very good idea. The more advanced you get, the more muscular, the stronger you get, the more even the switching doesn't cut it. If you're training hard enough, and as you get bigger and more muscular, you need a break, period. And I will tell you this, I'm just going to call you straight out. If you're interested in doing the best, it is not always going to be conducive to personal psychology. Mm-hmm. If you want the most jacked, deloading just might have to happen. I'm open to the idea that maybe deloading is overrated. Absolutely. Do I think that deloading in some situations has to happen? Yes. More generally, do I think that we have to do things do we not particularly fond of? Training? Fuck yeah. You imagine if someone else in your shoes said, you know, I want big legs. I've actually seen people on Facebook do this, but I don't like high bar squatting. I don't like squatting at all. What can I do?
Right.
Fuck off is what you can do. You won't have big legs. You can have pretty big legs, but if you're interested in, you know, sort of halfway measures, whatever, can you intelligently use variation to be able to train more and to be more productive? Absolutely. Can you obviate deloads altogether? Yes, until you get more advanced. As you get more advanced, the way I tell people is you either deload or your body deloads for you. And the way it deloads for you is front pec snaps off the bone, and you're like, well, that's a training break, right? So I think deload is a very good idea, but I'm definitely not of the opinion that you have to deload. You know, so there's people who took equipped powerlifting mesocycle structure and put right into bodybuilding, and they say, you know, I do 2 weeks up, 1 down, or 3 up, 1 down. Like,
Jesus Christ, you're deloading like 1/3 and 1/4 of the year. That's overkill for sure. And by using intelligent variation, good auto regulation, and not going too far in any of those microcycles, you could definitely go 5, maybe 6, some people 8 weeks of continuous volume load increases with a proper variation within there. But I do think formal deloading still has a place, and it has more of a place the more advanced you become.
Excellent, thank you. And to speak to the point of, the person who says, like, I want big legs and I don't want to squat, and what was your response? Fuck off?
More or less.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Is it as simple as if someone says they want the best results, you tell them this is exactly what you have to do, and if you have a problem with this, then you need to figure out what your priorities are?
There are some wiggle room. There's some wiggle room. So if someone says, I want to be the best butt, you can look at what their butts are and go, how can we work around this? It depends on the magnitude of their butts for a very terrible use of verbal language.
Their density.
That's right. That's right. Back to the Contreras interview. So, depends on how many exceptions they have. I'll put you very, 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 very clear scientific language. The incremental rise in exception magnitude and volume and seriousness is inversely related to the probability that they will attain their goals. So for example, just to use a very easy drug metaphor, if I said I wanted to be the best bodybuilder I could be, and then I said, but I don't want to use steroids, I mean, automatically is just a laughing stock joke. Never going to happen. If I said I don't want to use growth hormone, but I'll use steroids, you're not going to be the best you can be. I don't want to use insulin. Okay, maybe depending on how your waist turns out and all that stuff. Insulin is just for sheer size and actually throws off your symmetry, etc. So perhaps you could go really, really, really far. So if someone says, hey, listen, I want to be the best bodybuilder I can be, I'll do all the steroids, I'll do all the growth hormone, but I'm not going to do a ton of insulin, you could say, we probably will be able to get you pretty far, really, really close, or even there to the best you could have been. But if it starts saying, listen, best ever, I want to gain 50 pounds of muscle in the next year, I eat a strictly low-protein diet, I don't want to see anabolic steroids ever around me or any of the other drugs, I don't actually want to enter a weight room, at some point you're going to be like, well, you're not going to be jacked. Right? So if someone says, I want the biggest legs ever, but I don't want to squat, biggest legs ever, done, out. Nobody's done that without squats. I want really big legs. Then you have to kind of shit test them to be like, okay, how bad do you want really big legs? And they say, more than anything, fucking squat. More than anything, I want to do squats. Okay, you can have really big legs doing lunges, leg presses, other stuff, but is that demon in the back of your head is going to be like, I'm missing out. If you're okay with that, that's totally cool. But I think, so there is some wiggle room up there. You can do really, really well, but if you want to be the best, the best you can be, and someone offers you a plan, the amount of wiggle room is very small. It's the unfortunate fucking reality of life, more or less.
Right. So to speak to wanting to make the absolute best gains, something that struck me in discussing this with my colleague Kevin Butler is the issue of efficiency. Now, I know you said that you personally just aren't really interested in like the guy Joe who's 37 and wants to get a little bigger and not look grotesque when naked or whatever it might be. But even in the case of, let's say, Phil Heath, such an easy example, like efficiency still matters to him because time spent training is time not spent eating, sleeping, etc. So what if, and let's just grant this as a hypothetical, but I think it's very plausible that the hypertrophic response to volume is not just linear. It's not like one set, like 1 unit hypertrophy, 3 sets, 3 units, etc. What if the difference, like, what if Phil does 20 sets of back per week, and that produces like 90% of the total back hypertrophy he can get. And he's just a freak. He can do 40 sets a week, and that'll yield the additional, whatever it was, 5 or 10%.
10%.
Right. And maybe in that case it would make sense. But what if the difference is, at what point does it not make sense to do that additional volume given the low marginal return?
Yeah, easy. You just run a just traditional cost-benefit analysis. So you say, how many hours of sleep am I missing on because I train double what I'm supposed to be training for 90%? Mm-hmm. If it's like I miss a half an hour of sleep, maybe it's worth it. If I miss 3 hours of sleep, it's totally not fucking worth it. If I miss 2 whole food meals, definitely not worth it. If I miss this gigantic magnitude of recovery and adaptation, I would go so far as to use psychological variables. If I fucking hate training and I hate my life because I have to train double what I can for just 10% more, that's going to have a very high release of continuous cortisol, and it's going to affect you in numerous ways. It's going to affect everything else. It's probably not worth the cost. So what it comes down to is just run a traditional cost-benefit analysis and be very logical and attempt to be as clear as possible about that actual cost-benefit analysis, and not some emotional underlining where you're actually just being lazy, or on the other hand, you're like a suicidal machine and you know it's not worth it. You know, I've had times where it's like, okay, I could drive 40 minutes to a gym to do like a bicep forearm workout, or I could just fucking relax and go tomorrow when the gym is 10 minutes away anyway because I'll be in another location. If I pick option A, I'm just not well, and it's actually hurting my overall progress because the amount I spent 40 minutes, traffic, blah, 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 probably cost me more muscle than I would gain with that one workout. So people have this insane dedication to routine, and on principle, I must do this. On principle, you grow as much as you can. It's the only fucking principle that matters, and that means there needs to be some adaptability to what you're doing. So if Phil Heath, listen, if you feel Heath is get dick better to do, and he can take enough drugs to recover from the 40 sets a week, it's probably not worth it to him. Let's say, for example, if he has other body parts, he could be training more, right? Well, his arms could be training more. His legs could be training more. Mm-hmm. I'll put you this way. If he does an early qualifier show, he doesn't have to qualify anymore for the Olympics because he keeps fucking winning the thing. He gets reinvited automatically. But if he does a show, or let's say some guy takes second to him that's coming, and I say, look, you got him everywhere else. He's going to beat you from the back, and it's going to be bad news next year because he's like 32 and he's still getting bigger. And you're like 37, and it's going to be tough. Mm-hmm. You got to bring your back up, or else you're not Mr. Olympia anymore. Do you really think he's going to not do 40 sets a week? He's probably going to do 45 and break himself in half trying to be the best, right? And in that case, 40 is actually worth it. But in the grand scheme, from efficiency perspective, yes. And I'll add another thing to that really quickly. When we look at efficiency, a lot of times what we can X out is needless inefficiencies. You know, for example, guys wrapping their knees for the leg press. Shit takes like a fucking hour. You have to put more plates on each side for no fucking reason other than the fucking knee wraps to absorb your shit. I don't think there's anyone left that actually thinks, any intelligent people left that think knee wraps help your knees somehow. You put them on to use more fucking weight. You really fucking admit that, for God's sake. That's why powerlifters use them. There's no extra knee injuries, and we have a whole division of powerlifting now that doesn't use knee wraps. They're fine. Okay, knee wraps probably actually, if I was to use my biomechanical knowledge, probably track your knee more poorly than regular not knee wraps. So you got put 50 trillion knee wraps on, put a ton of plates on the leg press, put your feet up higher for no damn reason. That is a huge efficiency loss with no net gain, possibly just a net neutral result. If you put your feet lower on the platform, take 4 of those plates off, take the knee wraps off, you could be in and out of the leg press in 30 minutes versus 2.5 hours and get the same or better results. Mm-hmm. For those kinds of efficiencies, there's no need to consider that. It's a definite go. But for other stuff, like you said, is that 90% worth it? Yeah, it depends on how much it taxes your recovery adaptation and the rest of your life from the overall bodybuilding perspective. If bodybuilding's still number one in our lives. If it's not number one in our lives, if you have other things to attend to, it's totally cool, but then it just has to be an admitted trade-off. What I don't like to see is people taking the minimalist approach and kind of forgetting that they're making a trade-off. They'll say, well, you know, adherence is the only thing that matters. Yeah, if you have issues with adherence, totally. But when you're talking to people who want to be the best, adherence isn't a problem for them. They're psychotic anyway. They're addicted to weights. The other problem is not adherence. You try to get them to adhere less, they'd probably be better. So what I don't like it is when people say, you just do like the minimum, just do that 90% and you'll be fine. When you're speaking to someone who wants to be fine, who wants to be pretty big, pretty jacked, healthy, that's awesome. But you have to be clear that you're speaking to them. If you're speaking to someone who wants to be the best, being okay and fine is just some bullshit that goes in one ear or out the other, as well it should, because they shouldn't be interested in that sort of thing.
Do you think there's a risk that there really isn't a threat? And I know, by the way, that like I misunderstood MRV initially. I thought that it was kind of regarded as a hard number, and you've talked about it. What you've actually talked about it as being a range. But do you think there's a risk that it can just increase indefinitely? And here's what I'm thinking. You know, yes, if you have someone doing 1-rep maxes for squats, like you have a pretty clear sense of like how many times they can do that in a week. But what if it's like knee extensions with 30% of your 1-rep max? Like, could that person not theoretically just, like, literally the limitation would be their knee joint? And imagine how much volume that would be. And again, it brings me back to the point of like, at what point are you, yes, you're literally extending your knee, but the quadriceps are like 99.87% as stimulated as they possibly can be.
I think that one of the reasons that it's easy to conceive of MRV as not an infinite point you can't reach is that you can overreach your MRV quite easily. Mm-hmm. So if you can do 40 sets of knee extensions per week to get your 100% of your quad growth, or let's say in your perspective 99.7 or something, 45 sets per week isn't going to get you 99.1. It's going to get you 85. Because those extra 5 sets are actually over your ability to recover. They're now taxing you on the net. On the net balance, they are hurting you. They are interfering with adaptive capabilities. They are destroying structures. They're doing a variety of bad things, and they're taking away from your recovery. So that's the thing, the bell curve situation with MRV. Is going further, it doesn't just result in work that it's not junk volume. It's negative volume. It's junk volume for maybe a couple of sets. After that, it's actively negative. You will get smaller. You will be more prone to injury. The nervous system will degrade its ability to function. You will be weaker. So it's not one of those things where you keep going and going. It's not an asymptotic relationship. It looks like an asymptote, and then it drops to the other face. And my idea is that it actually drops off pretty significantly after just a little bit of hanging in there. So, for example, if your true MRV is 20 sets per week, can you still grow? Can you grow at 20? Yeah. Can you grow from 20 to 25? No, you won't make any gains, but you probably won't make any losses. You kind of just hang in there. After 25 to 30, you're going to get much worse. 30 to 35, you could get like long-term problems with the nervous system, benign fasciculations and all this other stuff where you fucked yourself up so much, essentially locally overtrained your musculature, which I've seen happen. I've done that shit to myself. And so the MRV is actually a range, which is important. It's not, you don't asymptotically approach MRV. You will pass it. So it's just as good to worry about, am I doing enough, as it is to worry about, am I doing too much?
But you would grant that there could be a scenario in which MRV is, well, yeah, you've already said that MRV exceeds maximum adaptive volume. So is that fundamentally the disagreement between you and advocates of what's been called minimum effective dose? And I wanted to note that I really don't perceive that view as being doing the absolute least amount that produces any beneficial effect you want. In other words, it doesn't, in the case of hypertrophy, it wouldn't mean the training which results in 0.1% of possible hypertrophy. It would mean the amount which reliably generates the result you actually want. So
I think that's a false definition right off the gate, because the result I actually want is to be the size of fucking Jupiter. I want to be the biggest fucking thing ever. I don't think it's very scientifically proper to define it as the result you want, but there's no such thing. So we got to name what percent of maximum adaptive proclivity it is, or capacity, or we've got to talk about grams of muscle per month or whatever. We can't say the results you want, because everyone wants to be the fucking greatest thing ever. So the results you want, this is how much you can earn from the results you want, are like the fucking here to the sun. So I don't agree with that definition. I think one of the biggest problems I've had discussing minimum effective dose is that there is no good definition for it. Minimum effective dose, as if we were to literally understand what it's saying the minimum dose required to produce an effect. Mm-hmm. If we say anything above that, we're assigning an arbitrary value to it, or a non-arbitrary but completely ridiculous value, like the results you want. Fuck, I want my pecs to be triple the size. What's the dose for that? Well, that's above my MRV by a long shot. And an MED is kind of pointless in that regard. I think the only way I've been able to define an effective dose is the dose above which you actually start to make gains, because we can hypothesize that there is sometimes dose, right? If like you just do 8 sets of squats per week or something like that, there's no way you're going to get any bigger because you're used to that shit. But if you do 6 sets of squats per week, you'll actually not be able to maintain your strength and size. You'll start to get smaller. 0, obviously, no, you'll get smaller for sure. Up to some value, which is your minimum effective dose, you'll just get less and less smaller over time until at your minimum effective dose, anything above that is going to get you finally now bigger. It's going to make you bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until you start to get close to your MRV. At your MRV, right at it, the top of it is the most you're ever going to be able to benefit from in that range. But you can't stay at your MRV for long because of cumulative fatigue. So when you hit your MRV, you can't stay there and say, this is the most training I'm going to do, because you're quickly are going to fatigue so much you can't maintain it. The proper approach is to start close to your minimum effective dose, go up to your MRV. That process of going up accumulates fatigue. Cumulative fatigue is something very few people talk about on this. It's a very big reality. whatever. Because people a lot of times want sustainable training. They want a program that continues to work. There is no program that continues to work. Overload principle and the fatigue management principle make that a null factor. There's no good training that you can keep doing by definition, because good training is overloading. Overload means you get benefits and you get cumulative fatigue. If you don't accumulate fatigue in your total body systems, in your local musculature over time, that is non-overloading training. If you can fully recover every week, you can be doing way more and getting way better. So we have to attend to that cumulative fatigue, which is why the MRV is only a once-at-a-time point type of thing. You only hit it for like a week or two. After that, you need to go back down. But if you're way under your MRV all the time, you could just simply be growing more. So why not do that? Which is one of the situations where I think the minimum effective dose, I don't want to say people, but kind of crowd, really missed out on the potential to kind of convert a lot of bros to science. Because you'll put out these workouts, it's like, 3 sets of 10 this, 4 sets of 10 that, you're good to go. And the bros go, I can do a lot more than this. And they go, trust me, you don't need to, man. This will be good enough. And just, what the fuck does that mean, good enough? And they look around and all the guys more jacked are more. They're like, well, fuck. Right? So they do more, they get more results, and then they think, I need to use a stupid way to train. Well, if interpreted that narrowly, it is a stupid way to train. So I think that, so let me ask you again, what is the reasonable definition for minimum effective dose? So it's something maybe between maximum adaptive volume and minimum effective dose? That's like pretty good gains, right? Like, you would agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not clear to me whether or not we disagree here. I would say that minimum effect, I think a reasonable definition is the minimum amount which generates the outcome you want. So, if you want your biceps to get bigger and you've been doing, I don't know why 2 sets a week came to mind. So you've been doing really low volume training and you go from that to 3 and your bicep, obviously this is going to be a subjective perception, but your subjective, or maybe you actually even have it tested and your biceps grow. So I would perceive that as a reasonable definition for minimum effective dose. Not minimum in the sense of like on a molecular level it's doing what you want, so technically it's effective, but like in a real world sense it's effective. And
okay.
Is this really a philosophical disagreement? Like, you want people... you want to be as big and as strong as you can be, and you think other people want that too. And I mean, obviously they do. They say that. But let's say someone says, I want to, they're a high-level amateur bodybuilder and they're shooting to be a pro, and like their objective is have the amount of muscle mass, and get lean enough and be proportionate enough, etc., to win a pro card. That's different, I think, than getting big as fuck. Like, I want to get as big as is humanly possible. So what would be wrong with that person saying, yes, maybe I could do 22 sets for quads a week, but I'm doing 12 really good sets, and my quads look the way they need to look for me to get on stage and do this.
What's wrong is when the guy who has bigger quads shows up and takes second, and you wonder why the fuck he didn't do 14, 16, or 18, or 20 sets. Right. That's it. So you're very results-oriented, in other words. So if that person does that and then they win, and let's just grant that they're below their MRV the whole time, would the thought be, well, you could have been even better. You could have, like, destroyed everyone even more than you did, so you should have. If I was a prep coach, I would be uncomfortable prescribing or agreeing to someone doing way below their MRV and nodding to them every week, looking at their pictures and going, you're doing great, when I realize that they could be doing better. It's, a similar situation with, there's this debate, I just imagine most of your viewers are drug-free and it's all good and well, but there's that kind of debate in the drug community of just take as much gear as will make you look like what you want. You mean like all the fucking gear in the world? I want to look like fucking Darkseid from fucking Superman. How's that sound? Like, well, you need to take everything. So the thing is, this is why the debate about how much do pros take is a pretty ludicrous one. Most pros take as much as they can fucking tolerate, to the point of not wanting to kill themselves or their blood pressure going so up high they blow up their eyes during squatting. Why? Because you're not just you're not taking the amount of drug that will make you good. They all look good. They already look good. It's going to be the amount of drug that makes you look better than that other guy who's also taking as much drugs as he can, who's also training as much as he can. So once you have that clear view of what is the most you can handle, from then you can start some trade-offs. But it's very important to understand that if you're a competitive athlete, you trading off and saying, for example, 12 sets of squats, you're growing great. If you're interested in great growth, awesome. That's great. You should keep doing that. Interested in possibly better growth, maybe you should do more, but maybe not. If you're really below your MRV, then yeah, you should do more. If you're interested in winning shows, can I look at you in the face and tell you that it's okay to do 12 sets? No, fuck no, I can't. I'd be like, someone is going to show up and outdo you, outperform you. This is kind of how it started in sport, where we got to this chronic attempt to overtrain in sport. Wrestling, volleyball, gymnastics. There's a such thing as a legitimately lazy athlete. I know we basically run it all in bodybuilding in our world. We deal with mostly voluntary athletes, and these people want to fucking do this. That's why they're on YouTube looking up Ian McCarthy debates, and that's why they're on there, because they fucking love it, and we have to push them to do less most of the time. But there are wrestlers, and there are volleyball players, etc. They're just gifted athletes. They would err on the side of the equivalent of 12 sets of squats, right, from wrestling perspective. They would want to leave after half an hour. Some wrestlers, they don't want to be there at all. They're just really gifted at wrestling. They learn a couple of good moves, 30 minutes, blah, 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 and they'll win states. But when they get to nationals, they just get burned. And the coach's job is to say, look, I know you want to do less, but this is how much we can do. And the guy who's going to win NCAAs, he's right here. And if you stop anywhere below that, he's going to beat your ass, because this is a living, fucking, breathing person who did go to his MRV. And now you have to tie up with the guy, and you're like, fuck, I wish I would have trained more. Too late. He's going to fucking eat you up. So if a bodybuilder is getting great results and he's interested in great results and he's below his MRV, I think that's good. I think there's some good arguments to be made there from a long-term perspective. I think intentionally you should save yourself from going to MRV too often if you're younger and you're developing. Kind of programs I prescribe for very, very, very beginner lifters are fractions of what they could recover from, especially the first few months of lifting and starting to get harder after that, because I think there's good for preserving joints to some extent and preserving the psychology to some extent. Grinding it close to your MRV often takes an advanced psychology of sport. It's not fun. People think it's fun. It's not very fun to train close to your MRV, but that's what makes you the best. So I think there's a good idea to preserve it to some extent. But when we're talking about competition, we're talking about your example of a top amateur bodybuilder who wants to turn pro. My friend and former student Jared Feather actually just did that, got his natural pro card. And every single show he did in which he was trying to attempt his natural pro card, we never had a single discussion other than about optimality. He's an obsessed guy anyway and only cares about optimality to begin with, but we never had a discussion with him where he was like, I can't do the following psychologically. It was just never, we agreed this is what has to be done, and he executed the plan. His pro card. Could he have won without that? Sure, but he couldn't have. So I think it's very good for us to admit offhand what is at least our best guess, scientific practitioners, optimal, and then after that, we have all the wiggle room we want as long as we're no longer shooting for optimality.
Gotcha.
Sorry to be long.
Oh, no worries. Do you think, I really appreciate the clarification, and what has struck me is that this terminology is now widely perpetuated in the evidence-based community, and what I'm wondering is, do you think there's a risk of people misapplying this? In other words, folks who aren't in that situation where they're willing, really willing to do whatever it takes. So if that means an additional 35 sets total, like full body volume in a week to get an additional 3% benefit, they'll do it. Is there a risk of people who aren't in that circumstance not understanding that and applying the same concept to their training? And really the question would be, what, if anything, do you feel you need to do about that? Or is it the audience needs to put what I'm saying in the proper context and understand it, and if they're just totally misunderstanding, then that's unfortunate, but I'm not responsible for that.
Caught the last part. I didn't catch the first part. Can you repeat the first part real quick, because my screen froze on me?
Yes, absolutely. Do you think there's a risk of people not in the position of really wanting to get 100% of the results they can and being totally willing to do everything that they need to do to get that, but latching on to this concept and going, all right, I'm going to apply that, fundamentally they want to look really good, they want to look proportionate, gain a good amount of muscle, be strong, etc., but if it's the difference between 85% of all gains and 100, and that means they have, in holding back, they have another 2 hours a week to spend with their spouse or something, do you think there's a risk of those people going, okay, MRV, MRV, when they actually shouldn't be? And then, for you as a public figure, what, if anything, do you feel you have to do about that? You know, are you obligated to additionally clarify, or does it really just come down to like, man, people need to think critically. If I'm talking about a guy who's trying to win the Olympia, I'm not talking about, you know, Sarah who wants to gain 6 pounds of muscle.
Yeah. I think that there's some very good value to the occasional, or perhaps more than occasional, conversation to get people to take some perspective and to understand that maybe burning themselves alive at the stake for the next gram of muscle is not what they actually want to do. I think that I, in the past, have made posts like that and made communications like that. I have given that attitude. And I think it's very wise to speak to those kinds of things. On the other hand, I think that a lot of people have been saying that kind of stuff, and I don't think anyone listens to just me, I hope, about advice for this kind of stuff. And there's so many other people making that point so very well that I think once you hear that side say bodybuilding and everything, if you just want 85%, you only have to do half the work, not 85% of the work, that sort of thing. They have that, and then me saying optimal, I think the average mix tends to be pretty good of them getting a good both perspectives of optimality and of restraint. And I think that on the net balance, most of those people come out okay. I don't think it's a matter of being like, well, fuck, man, I just give my advice out, and if you don't fucking understand it, fuck you. I think that's very crude. I wouldn't hope to be like that. I usually give that optimality advice because a lot of people are interested in that from me, because so many other people are talking about restraint and adherence and the world that I'm not one of the few, but one of the relatively few people who are saying, okay, you really want to fucking be the best, this is what you got to do. I think it is valuable, and I probably should do more of putting it in a real-world perspective. I think I do that every now and again, but maybe I can do more of it. So I do agree that it's important to have that in perspective. And I think it's important that some of that stuff come from me. Do I think I need to post every other post saying how it should be perspective, this and that? No, I think a lot of other people make up for that. But I think some I don't want to say lip service, that would have been the wrong term. Some input on that is a very good idea from me. I do agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And I wish I could remember who said this, but I vividly recall seeing a Facebook post in which someone said, seeking balance is admirable, but don't be surprised if you don't make the best progress you can in doing that. And I find that really insightful because, ultimately it is context dependent. Like, yes, if you have this is
still there?
Pardon? Did you hear any of that?
No, but I saw you moving really fast. All of it happened in about 5 seconds.
Perfect.
Can you repeat?
Sure, yeah. I was saying that I wish I could remember who said this, but I saw someone say on Facebook that it is admirable to seek balance, but don't be surprised if you don't make the best possible progress in doing that. And I do think there are commonalities here with dieting as well. Interestingly, as the guy who was the person who was there to popularize flexible dieting on YouTube, I'm very confident someone would have done it if not me, but interestingly, I found myself moving more and more in the direction of, actually, if you want the best possible progress, your diet's going to be pretty rigid. Like,
I've seen some of your posts lately, and I've seen some people get very confused
oh, yeah,
as to
yeah.
what you're saying, and
like,
I think for no good reason. I think you're very much on the right track.
I appreciate that, and I even had the thought last night, I was like, man, if someone is cognizant of what I was saying in like 2011 on this topic, and then what they're going to be like, what is going on here? But in my own case, most of my meals are almost identical from day to day. I institute nutrient timing, I distribute my protein, etc. Because recently it's just become more important that I look better. Like, that has become more important to me, so it's expressed in my behavior. And so in the past where I was more favoring balance, that was great, but my results were actually worse. So similarly with training, yeah, if you desire balance, great, but be very explicit about, I desire balance, I only want to train, I only want to train 3 days a week. Like, I'm going to make the best results I can with 3 days a week. Maybe I would make better results with 4 or 5 or 6, but the benefit of that isn't worth the cost in terms of less time with my spouse, with my friends, as you mentioned, my friends that I don't have, etc. So I would certainly agree with that.
Yeah, I think it's important for the consumer, the lifter, to know what they want quite clearly and know that there's a trade-off from getting the best possible and putting in a certain amount of work. What I don't like to see is people thinking they can get the best possible with a very minimum effort. And I don't like to see people on the other end thinking that to get just certain pretty reasonable goals, they need to completely change their whole life and start living like a pro bodybuilder. I think both of those lack some serious perspective. Hopefully I can give that kind of perspective every now and again on the one side, and other people get it on the other, and we can all come together for more rational recommendations. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a fantastic point at which to end it. I really appreciate you coming on. Hopefully folks aren't super turned off by the quality, but we'll see. We'll go. They need to sacrifice to win.
Awesome.
All right.
Right on. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Have a good one, Mike. Thanks again.
Take care.